What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actresses faces off against a late-night host who pushes too far? You won't believe what unfolds when Nicole Kidman sits down for what should have been a routine promotional interview, only to find herself under attack in ways that will leave you speechless. This isn't just another celebrity spat. This is a masterclass in how quickly a television interview can spiral into absolute chaos. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. The Late Show studio buzzed with its usual pre-taping energy last night, but something felt different from the moment Nicole Kidman walked through those backstage doors. Fresh off her latest critically acclaimed performance and riding high on award season buzz, the Australian actress was scheduled for what her publicist had promised would be a light, promotional chat about her new film. The show's producers had briefed everyone that this would be a friendly segment. After all, Kidman had appeared on the show before without incident. But as the cameras began rolling, it became clear that Stephen Colbert had something entirely different in mind. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incredible Nicole Kidman. Colbert announced with his trademark grin, but even from the opening moments, observant viewers could sense an edge to his demeanor that hadn't been there in previous interviews. Kidman gracefully took her seat, radiant in an elegant black dress. Her signature smile lighting up the studio as she settled into what she assumed would be another routine stop on her promotional tour. The first few minutes proceeded normally enough. Colbert asked about her latest project, a psychological thriller that had been generating significant Oscar buzz. Kidman spoke passionately about the challenging role, describing the months of preparation and the emotional toll of inhabiting such a complex character. Her answers were thoughtful, articulate, and exactly what viewers had come to expect from one of Hollywood's most professional actresses. But then something shifted. As Kidman finished explaining her character's motivations, Colbert's expression changed. The warm, welcoming host persona seemed to evaporate, replaced by something harder, more calculating. He leaned forward in his chair, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a sharp edge that made everyone in the studio sit up and take notice. "You know, Nicole, I have to ask," Colbert began, his voice taking on that particular cadence he used. When he was about to make a point that cut deep, "There's been a lot of talk recently about your personal life, specifically about your relationship with your children from your marriage to Tom Cruise. Some people are saying that your involvement with certain organizations has created distance between you and your kids. How do you respond to critics who say you've chosen career and beliefs over family?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Kidman's smile faltered for just a moment, a barely perceptible crack in her composed facade that the cameras caught with devastating clarity. This wasn't the kind of question she'd been prepared for. Her publicist, watching from the wings, visibly tensed, while audience members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "I'm sorry, Stephen, but I'm not sure what you're referring to," Kidman replied carefully, her voice maintaining its professional tone despite the obvious blindside. "My family is incredibly important to me, and I've always tried to keep my children's privacy protected. I don't think it's appropriate to discuss my relationship with them in this kind of forum." But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, her diplomatic response seemed to embolden him. He shuffled through his notes with theatrical precision, clearly preparing for his next assault. The studio audience, which had been warmly receptive moments earlier, now sat in uncomfortable silence, sensing that something was going very wrong. "Come on, Nicole," Colbert pressed, his tone becoming more aggressive. "We're all adults here. Your fans want to know the real you, not just the carefully managed public image. There are reports from very credible sources suggesting that your children have chosen to live primarily with their father, and that they've distanced themselves from you specifically because of choices you've made. Don't you think your audience deserves some honesty about how your personal decisions have affected your family?" The accusation was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut through any defense Kidman might mount. Her composure, legendary throughout Hollywood for its unshakable nature, began to show hairline cracks. Her hands, which had been resting comfortably in her lap, now gripped the arms of her chair. The warmth in her eyes was replaced by something much colder, much more dangerous. "Stephen, I came here tonight to talk about my work," she said, her Australian accent becoming more pronounced as her emotional control began to slip. I didn't come here to be ambushed about my personal life or to have my relationship with my children questioned by someone who doesn't know the first thing about my family dynamics. This is completely inappropriate. The tension in the studio was now palpable. Crew members behind the cameras shifted nervously, unsure whether they should continue filming or cut away. Kidman's publicist had moved closer to the stage area, clearly, preparing to intervene if necessary. But Colbert seemed energized by the conflict he'd created, feeding off the discomfort he'd unleashed. But Nicole, he continued, his voice dripping with false concern, isn't this exactly the kind of thing that makes people question your authenticity? You present this perfect image, this devoted mother persona, but then when pressed about the reality of your family life, you get defensive and refuse to engage. Maybe that's exactly why your kids have distanced themselves, because they can't get past the public relations version of their mother to find the real person underneath. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Kidman's face went through a series of micro-expressions: hurt, anger, disbelief, and finally, a cold fury that anyone who knew her well would recognize as dangerous territory. The gracious, media-trained actress was rapidly disappearing, replaced by a woman who had been pushed too far by someone who had clearly done his homework on exactly where to aim his attacks. "How dare you?" she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of absolute outrage. "How dare you sit there and make assumptions about my children, about my family, about relationships you know absolutely nothing about? You've crossed a line here, Stephen, and I think you know it." Asterisk. But rather than backing down or attempting to defuse the situation he'd created, Colbert doubled down with the kind of reckless abandon that would soon prove to be his undoing. He leaned back in his chair with a smug expression that suggested he was enjoying every moment of Kidman's discomfort. "I'm just asking the questions that your fans are thinking," he replied with mock innocence. "Isn't that what good journalism is supposed to be about? Getting past the surface, finding the truth that lies underneath all the carefully constructed public image work? Your publicists can't protect you from legitimate questions about your life choices and their consequences forever." The studio had gone completely silent now, save for the hum of cameras and the barely audible whispers of crew members who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was character assassination being broadcast live to millions of viewers, and everyone present knew they were watching something that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Kidman's response, when it came, was delivered with the kind of controlled intensity that only comes from years of channeling raw emotion into professional performance. "Let me be very clear about something, Stephen," she began, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of barely contained rage. "I have spent decades in this industry being professional, being gracious, and treating people with respect even when they don't deserve it. But what you're doing right now isn't journalism, it's exploitation. You're using my children, my personal pain, as entertainment for your audience, and that is absolutely unforgivable." The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Colbert's smug expression wavered slightly, but rather than recognizing the warning in her tone, he seemed to interpret her passion as weakness, as an opportunity to press his advantage even further. "But Nicole," he said, adopting a tone of mock concern that only made his attack more vicious, "don't you think your fans deserve to know who they're really supporting? I mean, we're talking about a woman who has publicly aligned herself with controversial beliefs that have allegedly cost her relationships with her own children. How do you reconcile promoting family values in your movies while your own family situation tells a very different story?" The accusation was delivered with surgical precision, clearly designed to maximize damage. Kidman's composure, which had held strong through decades of Hollywood pressures, finally began to crack in a way that was visible to everyone watching. Her hands were now visibly trembling. Whether from anger or hurt was impossible to tell, but the effect was devastating to witness. "You want to talk about family values?" she shot back, her Australian accent now thick with emotion. "Let's talk about your values, Stephen. Let's talk about a man who invites someone to his show under the pretense of a professional interview and then ambushes them with personal attacks. Let's talk about someone who thinks it's acceptable to use a mother's relationship with her children as a punchline for his monologue." The studio audience, which had been uncomfortably silent throughout the exchange, began to shift restlessly. Some were clearly disturbed by what they were witnessing, while others seemed drawn in by the raw, unfiltered conflict playing out before them. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every micro-expression, every moment of tension that would soon be dissected by millions of viewers. But Colbert wasn't finished. In what would later be recognized as the moment he crossed from inappropriate into inexcusable, he leaned forward with the kind of predatory smile that had served him well in his satirical persona, but was absolutely devastating in this context. "You know what I think, Nicole?" he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow made his words even more cutting. "I think you're deflecting because you know I'm right. I think you're angry because someone finally had the courage to ask you the questions that everyone in Hollywood has been whispering about for years. How does it feel to know that your own children have chosen to distance themselves from you? How does it feel to know that your career ambitions and personal choices have cost you the most important relationships in your life?" The question landed like a physical blow. Kidman's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, and then something much darker, much more dangerous. The gracious actress who had walked onto the stage was completely gone now, replaced by a woman who had been pushed beyond her breaking point by someone who clearly had no understanding of the line he had just crossed. "Stop," she said quietly, but her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the studio freeze. "Just stop talking right now." But Colbert, perhaps intoxicated by the conflict he had created, perhaps simply too committed to his attack to back down, made the fatal mistake of continuing. His next words would be the ones that ended his career and destroyed his reputation. In a single moment of breathtaking cruelty. "I'm sorry if the truth hurts, Nicole, but maybe if you'd made different choices, if you'd prioritized your children over your image, over your beliefs, maybe they wouldn't have felt the need to distance themselves from you. Maybe if you'd been a better mother dash." He never got to finish the sentence. Kidman's reaction was immediate and explosive, her years of professional training completely abandoned in the face of an attack that was so personal, so cruel, that it demanded an immediate response. "How dare you?" she exploded, rising from her chair with such force that it rolled backward several feet. "How dare you sit there and question my abilities as a mother? You don't know anything about my children, about my family, about the sacrifices I've made or the pain I've endured. You're a pathetic little man who gets his thrills from attacking women who can't fight back because they're trapped in your studio, forced to smile and be polite while you destroy them for your entertainment." The studio erupted into chaos. Audience members gasped audibly, some covering their mouths in shock, others pulling out phones to record what was clearly going to be a viral moment. Crew members looked frantically between each other, unsure whether to keep filming or cut the cameras. Kidman's publicist was now moving rapidly toward the stage, but she was too far away to intervene in what was unfolding. Colbert, for his part, seemed stunned by the ferocity of her response. The smug confidence that had carried him through his attack was rapidly evaporating, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. He had clearly expected Kidman to maintain her professional composure, to take his abuse with grace and dignity. He had not prepared for the unleashing of raw, unfiltered rage from one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. "Nicole, please," he stammered, finally realizing that he had pushed too far. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding." She cut him off, her voice rising to a level that carried clearly throughout the entire studio. "There's no misunderstanding here, Stephen. You deliberately and maliciously attacked me using the most personal, painful aspects of my life. You used my children as weapons against me, and you did it for ratings, for clicks, for your own sick entertainment. That's not a misunderstanding. That's character assassination." The confrontation had now reached a point where it was clear to everyone watching that there was no coming back from this moment. The professional relationship between host and guest had been completely destroyed, replaced by something much more raw and dangerous. Kidman stood over Colbert, her entire body radiating fury, while he sat in his chair looking smaller and more pathetic with each passing second. "You want to know about family values?" she continued, her voice now carrying the kind of authority that comes from absolute moral certainty. "Let me tell you about family values. Family values means protecting your children from people like you. Family values means not exploiting someone's personal pain for profit. Family values means having the basic human decency to treat people with respect, especially when they're guests in your house. The audience was completely silent now, transfixed by the raw emotion playing out before them. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something much more real, much more uncomfortable, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. But even as Kidman delivered her devastating counterattack, it was clear that the damage had been done. The line had been crossed. The relationship between host and guest had been irrevocably destroyed, and what happened next would determine not just the fate of this particular interview, but the future careers of both people involved. As the tension reached its absolute peak. With Kidman standing over a now visibly shaken Colbert, the studio held its collective breath, waiting to see how this explosive confrontation would reach its inevitable conclusion. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant hum of cameras and the barely audible whispers of crew members who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Kidman's chest rose and fell with the rhythm of barely controlled fury. Her eyes locked on Colbert with an intensity that made him visibly shrink back in his chair. The man who had seemed so confident, so in control just moments earlier, now looked like exactly what he was. A bully who had finally encountered someone willing to fight back. "You know what the most pathetic part of this is, Stephen?" Kidman said, her voice now deadly calm in a way that was somehow more terrifying than her earlier explosion. "You actually think you're the good guy here. You think you're some kind of crusading journalist exposing hypocrisy, but you're nothing more than a schoolyard bully who gets his kicks from hurting people who can't fight back. The only difference is that you hide behind your desk and your cameras and your audience, thinking that makes you untouchable." Colbert opened his mouth to respond, but Kidman wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and years of frustration. With invasive media, with people who thought her celebrity status gave them the right to attack her most personal relationships, came pouring out in a torrent of righteous anger. "Do you have children, Stephen?" she asked, the question cutting through the air like a blade. "Do you have kids who you love more than your own life? Because if you do, then you know exactly how disgusting what you just did really is. You used my children, my babies, as ammunition. In your pathetic attempt to humiliate me on national television, you crossed every line of human decency. And for what? For ratings? For a viral moment? For the sick pleasure of watching someone suffer." The cameras continued to roll, capturing every word, every gesture, every moment of this career-defining confrontation. Kidman's publicist had finally reached the edge of the stage area, but she held back, recognizing that her client was handling this situation with more power and authority than any intervention could provide. "I have spent 30 years in this industry," Kidman continued, her voice building in intensity with each word. 30 years of smiling politely while people like you think they have the right to dissect my personal life for entertainment. 30 years of being professional, of being gracious, of turning the other cheek when people attack me, my choices, my family. But you know what? I'm done. I'm done being polite to people who don't deserve it. I'm done protecting the feelings of bullies who think cruelty is entertainment." Colbert finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak, desperate attempt to salvage a situation that was spiraling completely beyond his control. "Nicole, I think maybe we should take a break. Maybe we can dash." "No," she cut him off with such force that he actually flinched. "No, we're not taking a break. We're not going to commercial. We're not going to pretend this didn't happen. You wanted to expose the real me? Well, congratulations, Stephen. This is the real me. This is what happens when you push someone too far, when you cross lines that should never be crossed, when you use someone's children as weapons against them." The studio audience was completely transfixed now, some visibly uncomfortable, others seeming to feed off the raw emotion playing out before them. Several people in the front rows were openly recording with their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. "You want to know about my children?" Kidman said, her voice now carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "My children are the most important thing in my life. Every decision I make, every choice I face, I consider how it will affect them. I have sacrificed career opportunities, personal happiness, and countless other things to try to protect them from exactly this kind of exploitation. And you pathetic excuse for a human being. You just used them as a punchline. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the studio, before delivering what would become the most quoted line from the entire confrontation. I came here tonight as a professional, prepared to do my job and promote my work. But you didn't want a professional interview. You wanted blood sport. You wanted to humiliate me, to break me down, to use my personal pain as entertainment for your audience. Well, congratulations, Stephen. You got exactly what you wanted. But you also got something you didn't expect. You got to see what happens. When you underestimate someone, when you think being cruel makes you clever. Colbert made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Nicole, please, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. If you could just sit down, we could sit down, she laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitter contempt. You think I'm going to sit down and pretend this conversation is salvageable? You think I'm going to smile and be gracious after you attack my children? You think I'm going to give you the chance to twist this into some kind of mutual misunderstanding? She shook her head slowly, her expression shifting from fury to something that looked almost like pity. You know what the saddest part of this is, Stephen? You actually had the opportunity to have a real conversation with me tonight. You could have asked me about my work, about my craft, about the projects I'm passionate about. You could have been a real journalist, someone who elevates the conversation instead of dragging it down into the gutter. But instead, you chose to be a bully. You chose to be cruel. And now you have to live with the consequences of that choice. The finality in her voice was unmistakable. Everyone in the studio knew that this interview was over, that there was no coming back from this moment. Kidman stepped back from Colbert's desk, her posture straightening as she prepared to deliver her final statement. I want everyone watching this to understand something, she said, her voice now carrying clearly throughout the entire studio. This is what happens when media personalities think they can hide behind their platforms to attack people. This is what happens when someone confuses cruelty with cleverness, when they think being mean makes them edgy or relevant. Stephen Colbert just showed you exactly who he really is. Not a comedian, not a journalist, but a bully who gets his entertainment from causing pain to others. She turned to leave, but then paused, looking back at Colbert one final time. And just so we're absolutely clear, she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the studio lean forward to catch every word. I will never, ever appear on your show again. And I will make sure that every person in this industry knows exactly what kind of man you really are. You wanted to expose someone tonight, Stephen? Mission accomplished. You exposed yourself. With that, Nicole Kidman turned and walked off the stage with the kind of dignity and grace that only comes from knowing you've stood up for yourself in the face of unconscionable behavior. Her heels clicked against the studio floor as she made her way toward the exit, her publicist falling into step beside her, while behind them, the studio remained in stunned silence. Colbert sat at his desk, looking smaller and more pathetic than anyone had ever seen him. The confident, smirking host who had begun the interview was gone, replaced by a man who clearly understood that he had just made a career-defining mistake. The cameras continued to roll, capturing his obvious distress, his fumbling attempts to regain his composure, his desperate glances toward his producers for guidance that wasn't coming. As Kidman reached the exit, she paused one final time, not to look back at Colbert, but to address the audience directly. Thank you for witnessing this, she said simply. Thank you for seeing what really happened here tonight. And I hope that when you go home, you'll remember that celebrities are human beings too. We have feelings, we have families, we have children. We love and want to protect. We don't deserve to be attacked simply because we're in the public eye. And with that, Nicole Kidman walked out of the studio, leaving behind a host whose career would never recover from the moment he decided to use a mother's love for her children as ammunition in his quest for viral fame. The confrontation was over, but its impact would be felt for years to come, serving as a reminder that even in the world of entertainment, there are lines that should never be crossed and consequences for those who choose to cross them anyway.